At 3 a.m. on September 13, 1940, a German bomb fell into the quadrangle of Buckingham Palace. The explosion tore through the private chapel. Glass shattered inward across polished floors. Doors were blown from their hinges and thrown down corridors designed for ceremony, not shock waves. The air filled with dust and fragments of stone that had been laid more than a century earlier to suggest permanence. The king and queen were inside. They were not harmed. By morning, they stood in the courtyard, surveying damage that seemed both catastrophic and strangely contained. The façade still held its composure. The long, symmetrical frontage, familiar, controlled, almost impassive, remained largely intact, as if the building had absorbed the violence without acknowledging it. But the chapel was gone. In the days that followed, the palace did not retreat from view. It remained occupied, lit, and visible. The damage was repaired, not erased. What had been broken became part of its continuity. Yet the moment exposed something difficult to ignore. This was a structure designed to represent stability at a scale few private residences could approach. Hundreds of rooms. Endless corridors. A central courtyard large enough to contain both ceremony and silence. It had been expanded, reshaped, and reinforced to function as the visible heart of a monarchy that claimed endurance beyond individual lives. And still, a single night reduced part of it to rubble. Buckingham Palace was never meant to be vulnerable. It was meant to stand as proof that certain institutions did not require justification, only recognition. But over time, the building has asked a different question of those who maintain it. Not whether it can survive damage, but whether it can continue to explain why it exists at all. Long before it became a palace, the land was wet. In the early 17th century, the area that would eventually hold Buckingham Palace lay on the western edge of London, beyond the city's dense and shifting core. It was not considered prime ground. The soil was soft, fed by small, slow-moving streams that drained toward the River Thames. Parts of it were marshland. In winter, it held water. In summer, it dried unevenly, leaving patches of unstable earth. There was no architectural intention here. No axis, no façade, no sense of permanence. Only open ground, used intermittently, valued inconsistently. The first structures were modest and temporary, small houses, garden plots, and leased parcels that changed hands without ceremony. Ownership in this part of London did not yet imply significance. It implied opportunity, but not certainty. By the late 17th century, London itself was expanding outward. The city's elite began to look beyond its crowded interior, seeking air, distance, and privacy. What had once been peripheral land began to attract attention, not because of what it was, but because of what it might become. In 1703, a house was built on this ground for John Sheffield, the Duke of Buckingham. It was not conceived as a palace. Known as Buckingham House, the structure was large by the standards of a private residence, but it did not attempt grandeur beyond its function. It was a townhouse, symmetrical, controlled, and proportioned for a single aristocratic family. Its design reflected restraint rather than dominance. Brick rather than stone. A central block rather than a sprawling complex. It faced inward more than outward. The house did not command the city. It stood slightly apart from it, surrounded by gardens that softened its presence. Its architecture suggested comfort and status, but not authority. It was a place to reside, not to represent. For decades, Buckingham House remained exactly that. Ownership passed quietly. Its role did not expand. It was neither the center of political life nor a symbol of national identity. Other royal residences, St. James's Palace, Kensington Palace, carried the weight of monarchy. Buckingham House remained peripheral, both geographically and symbolically. In 1761, it was purchased by King George III. The transaction did not immediately transform the building's meaning. The king did not intend to relocate the full machinery of monarchy into its rooms. Instead, he acquired it as a private retreat for Queen Charlotte, a place removed from the formal expectations of court life. It became known, informally, as the Queen's House. This distinction mattered. The building was not yet burdened with representation. It did not host the rituals that defined royal visibility. It was used for domestic life, family, children, quieter routines that unfolded beyond the structured gaze of the public. Its scale, though substantial, still aligned with this purpose. It was large enough to accommodate comfort, but not so large as to overwhelm it. Inside, the atmosphere was different from the established palaces of the monarchy. There were fewer expectations embedded in the walls. Fewer precedents dictating movement, speech, and behavior. The architecture allowed for a kind of informality that older royal buildings resisted. But even in this phase, subtle pressures began to emerge. The location, once peripheral, was becoming more central as London continued to grow. Roads improved. Surrounding land was developed. The distance that had once defined Buckingham House began to shrink, not physically, but socially. The city was moving toward it. At the same time, the monarchy itself was changing. George III's reign unfolded during a period of increasing scrutiny. Political tensions, colonial conflicts, and shifts in public perception began to reshape the expectations placed upon the crown. The idea of a private royal residence, separate from public duty, became more complicated. Buckingham House sat at the intersection of these changes. It was still, in function, a home. But its association with the royal family began to alter how it was seen. The building had not changed in structure, yet its meaning was no longer fixed. It occupied a space between private retreat and emerging symbol, without fully committing to either. This ambiguity defined its early existence. No grand vision guided its expansion. No singular architect imposed a lasting ideology upon its form. It evolved incrementally, responding to needs that were immediate rather than strategic. Rooms were added. Interiors were modified. Gardens were adjusted. Each change was practical. None were intended to prepare it for what it would eventually become. And so, for much of the 18th century, Buckingham House remained underestimated, not because it lacked size or quality, but because it lacked purpose beyond its occupants. It did not yet carry the weight of expectation. It did not need to justify itself. It existed because it was useful. Nothing in its early history suggested that it would become the primary residence of a monarchy, or that its walls would one day be required to represent an entire nation's idea of continuity. It was, at its origin, a house placed on uncertain ground. And for a time, that was enough. The transformation did not begin with confidence. By the early 19th century, Buckingham House remained structurally intact but conceptually unresolved. It was still a residence, still inhabited, still functional, but increasingly inadequate for the image the monarchy was expected to project. The building had grown in fragments, without a unifying vision. Its proportions no longer matched its symbolic burden. In 1820, George IV ascended the throne. He did not inherit a palace. He inherited a problem. George IV understood architecture not as shelter, but as expression. He had already reshaped other royal properties with a distinct and often excessive aesthetic language. For him, buildings were instruments, designed to communicate authority, taste, and permanence through scale and detail. Buckingham House, in its current form, communicated none of these things with sufficient clarity. Within a year, the decision was made to transform it. John Nash, the architect chosen for the task, approached the project as both expansion and reinvention. The original house would not be demolished. It would be absorbed, encased within a new architectural framework that extended outward, creating wings, courtyards, and a more formalized structure. The building began to grow in three directions at once. What had once been a single, inward-facing block became a composition of connected volumes. New facades were introduced, more elaborate and more assertive than the original brick exterior. Stone replaced restraint. Ornament replaced simplicity. The scale shifted rapidly. Rooms were enlarged, not for comfort, but for procession. Corridors were extended to control movement, not merely to connect spaces. Staircases became statements, broad, deliberate, designed to slow the body and elevate the act of arrival. The architecture began to dictate behavior. Where Buckingham House had allowed for informality, the emerging palace imposed structure. Movement through the building was no longer neutral. It was choreographed. Each room implied a function beyond its physical boundaries: reception, display, hierarchy. Numbers began to accumulate. The building expanded to include over 700 rooms. Of these, dozens were designated for state functions, spaces that would be used not for living, but for representing. The ballroom alone would eventually stretch over 36 meters in length, large enough to hold hundreds of guests in a single, continuous space. But the numbers were not merely indicators of size. They were indicators of intention. This was no longer a residence adapting to need. It was a structure asserting identity. The monarchy, through architecture, was attempting to fix its image in physical form, permanent, legible, and unmistakable. Yet the process was unstable. Costs escalated beyond initial estimates. Nash's designs, while ambitious, were also financially unsustainable. Materials were expensive. Modifications were frequent. What began as a transformation became a prolonged negotiation between vision and limitation. By 1828, Nash was dismissed. The building was incomplete. Edward Blore, his successor, continued the work with greater restraint. Where Nash had expanded outward with confidence, Blore adjusted, corrected, and contained. The palace reached a form of structural completion, but the coherence of its design remained uneven, a combination of ambition and compromise. Still, the essential shift had occurred. Buckingham House no longer existed as it once had. In 1837, Queen Victoria moved into the building as her principal residence. With this decision, the transformation was no longer architectural alone, it became institutional. The palace was not simply a larger house. It was now the central stage upon which monarchy would be seen, measured, and interpreted. And yet, even in its expanded form, the building resisted its role. Ventilation was poor. Heating was inconsistent. Layouts, designed for display, did not always accommodate daily life. The sheer scale of the structure created distances that complicated routine. Rooms intended for grandeur proved difficult to inhabit. The architecture had achieved presence. But presence was not the same as functionality. The palace projected stability through its size, its symmetry, and its controlled facades. It suggested that the monarchy occupied a space beyond ordinary constraint. That it existed in continuity with a past that could not be easily disrupted. But internally, the building told a different story. It was still adjusting. Still compensating. Still reconciling what it had been with what it was expected to become. Its ambition was visible in every corridor. So was its uncertainty. By the mid-19th century, Buckingham Palace had achieved the appearance of completion. Its facades were aligned. Its wings enclosed the central quadrangle with controlled symmetry. Its interiors, layered with gilded moldings, heavy drapery, and polished surfaces, presented a continuous visual language of authority. From the outside, the building suggested order. Inside, the experience was less resolved. Queen Victoria entered the palace in 1837 as a young monarch, newly ascended, carrying expectations that extended far beyond her years. The building she inherited was vast, but not yet stable in its function. It required not only occupation, but adaptation. Rooms designed for ceremony remained unused for long periods. Others, intended for private life, proved impractical. Air did not circulate easily. Corridors retained cold in winter and heat in summer. Sound moved unpredictably through the structure, voices carried, doors echoed, footsteps lingered longer than expected. The palace was not silent. It was filled with movement, but not always with ease. Servants navigated its corridors with precision, maintaining a system that operated largely out of sight. Meals appeared without visible preparation. Fires were lit before occupants entered rooms. Curtains were drawn and adjusted according to routines that followed both daylight and expectation. The building demanded constant management. To maintain the illusion of effortlessness, hundreds of individuals worked within its walls, often in spaces that contrasted sharply with the rooms they served. Narrow passages, low ceilings, and confined quarters supported the larger architecture above, hidden layers that sustained visible order. Hierarchy was embedded in the layout. Access was controlled not only by role, but by space. Certain corridors were reserved. Certain staircases were designated for specific uses. Movement through the palace reinforced social structure. To pass through a particular door was to acknowledge a position within a system that the building itself enforced. For Queen Victoria, the palace became both residence and stage. Public receptions, state dinners, and formal gatherings required the building to function as a backdrop for ritual. Guests entered through carefully orchestrated sequences: approach, arrival, ascent, presentation. Each step was shaped by architecture that guided perception as much as movement. But outside these moments, the scale of the palace created distance. Private life did not disappear, but it became dispersed. Family routines unfolded across rooms separated by long corridors and multiple thresholds. The effort required to move from one part of the building to another introduced a subtle friction, small delays that accumulated over time. The palace did not compress life. It stretched it. This stretching affected relationships. Conversations were scheduled rather than incidental. Encounters were often mediated by space, anticipated, rather than spontaneous. Even within a household, proximity could not be assumed. The building allowed for presence, but also for separation. After the death of Prince Albert in 1861, this separation deepened. Victoria withdrew from public life, and with her withdrawal, the palace changed in tone. Rooms once used for gatherings fell into disuse. Curtains remained closed. Sections of the building, though maintained, were no longer animated by activity. The architecture remained intact. But its purpose shifted. The palace had been designed to accommodate visibility, to present monarchy as continuous, accessible, and structured. In the absence of that visibility, its scale began to emphasize absence instead. Large rooms, when unoccupied, did not diminish. They expanded. Silence became more pronounced. The building did not adapt quickly to this change. Its systems continued to operate. Fires were still lit. Floors were still cleaned. But the rhythm that had once justified these actions weakened. Maintenance persisted, even when meaning did not. And yet, the palace could not fully retreat. State functions resumed when required. Ceremonies were held within spaces that had been temporarily withdrawn from daily use. The building shifted between modes, private and public, inhabited and suspended, without fully resolving either. This oscillation became part of its character. Buckingham Palace was no longer simply a residence. It was a structure that imposed expectations on its occupants, while also reflecting their absences. It required performance, but could not sustain it alone. The walls did not change. But what they contained, and what they lacked, began to alter how the building was experienced. Not only by those who lived within it, but by those who observed it from beyond its gates. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It accumulated, quietly, persistently, across decades in which the palace remained physically stable but increasingly exposed to forces it had not been designed to withstand. Buckingham Palace had been constructed to project continuity, not to negotiate it. Its architecture assumed endurance. It did not anticipate the need for justification. By the early 20th century, that assumption began to erode. The First World War altered the conditions under which monarchy could exist. Distance between institution and public became more difficult to sustain. Visibility was no longer ceremonial, it became necessary. The palace, with its enclosed courtyards and controlled facades, was not designed for this kind of exposure. Adjustments were made, but the structure itself resisted transformation. Then, in 1936, the monarchy encountered a crisis that did not originate from war or economics, but from within. King Edward VIII abdicated the throne. The event unfolded quickly, but its impact lingered. The palace, as the physical center of monarchy, absorbed the consequences of a decision that revealed the limits of tradition when confronted with personal choice. The building remained unchanged, yet its symbolic stability had been disrupted. Rooms that had prepared for one occupant were reassigned to another. Ceremonial spaces adapted without acknowledgement. The architecture did not pause. It continued to function, even as the meaning of what it contained shifted beneath it. But it was the Second World War that exposed the palace most directly. Between 1940 and 1941, Buckingham Palace was struck by German bombs multiple times. The attacks were not incidental. The building was a target, not for its military value, but for what it represented. To damage the palace was to challenge the idea of permanence it embodied. The strikes were uneven. Some caused limited structural damage. Others penetrated deeper, destroying rooms, altering interiors, leaving visible scars that could not be entirely concealed. The private chapel, reduced to rubble, was not rebuilt in its original form. Absence became part of the architecture. Yet the palace did not close. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth chose to remain. Their presence within the damaged building was deliberate. It transformed the palace from a distant symbol into a shared risk. The decision did not repair the structure, but it altered its perception. For a time, the palace no longer stood apart from the conditions surrounding it. It endured them. This endurance, however, came with a cost. The war accelerated changes that had already begun. After 1945, Britain entered a period of economic constraint. Resources were limited. Public expectations shifted. Institutions once accepted without question were now examined more closely. The palace, with its scale and maintenance requirements, became difficult to reconcile with these conditions. Its costs were no longer abstract. Heating hundreds of rooms, maintaining extensive grounds, preserving aging materials, these were ongoing demands that persisted regardless of how frequently the spaces were used. The building required constant attention, even when its functions were reduced. Visibility increased again, but under different terms. Public access expanded in controlled ways. Portions of the palace were opened during specific periods, allowing individuals to move through rooms that had once been reserved for ceremony or privacy. This access did not diminish the building's scale, but it altered its relationship to the public. The palace was no longer entirely separate. It was observed, measured, and compared. Criticism followed. Questions emerged regarding cost, relevance, and purpose. The palace, designed to represent unquestioned authority, now existed within a context that required explanation. Its architecture, once sufficient as a statement, became part of a broader discussion it could not control. The breaking point was not a single event. It was the accumulation of these pressures, war, abdication, economic strain, and increasing scrutiny, that reshaped the conditions under which Buckingham Palace could exist. The building remained. But the assumptions that had defined its purpose did not. The palace did not collapse. It adjusted. After the war, Buckingham Palace entered a period defined not by expansion or destruction, but by negotiation. Its structure remained largely intact. Its facades continued to present symmetry and control. But the conditions surrounding it had shifted in ways that architecture alone could not resolve. The building had been designed to project permanence without explanation. Now, explanation became part of its function. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, the monarchy adapted its relationship to the public, and the palace was required to follow. What had once been a contained environment, regulated, distant, and largely inaccessible, began to open in measured ways. State rooms, previously used only for ceremony, were made available to visitors during specific periods. Movement through the building was no longer reserved exclusively for those within its hierarchy. The architecture, once experienced by a limited few, became subject to a broader gaze. This did not reduce its scale. But it changed how that scale was interpreted. Rooms designed to impress foreign dignitaries now accommodated steady flows of visitors moving at a controlled pace. Corridors that once guided ceremonial processions became pathways marked by quiet observation. The building's function expanded beyond representation, it entered the realm of exhibition. Yet the palace resisted full transformation. Large sections remained inaccessible. Private quarters continued to operate under different rules, maintaining separation within a structure that was increasingly visible. The building existed in two states at once, open and closed, public and private, observed and concealed. This duality introduced tension. Maintenance costs did not diminish with increased access. The infrastructure, aging, extensive, and often concealed within the fabric of the building, required constant attention. Electrical systems, plumbing, structural reinforcements, these were not part of the palace's visible identity, but they determined its ability to continue functioning. By the late 20th century, the scale of these requirements became more widely known. Repairs were no longer discrete. Reports outlined the need for significant restoration, work that would extend over years, involving hundreds of rooms and systems that had not been comprehensively updated for decades. The palace, constructed to suggest timelessness, revealed its dependence on continuous intervention. It could not sustain itself. At the same time, public perception continued to shift. Events within the royal family, marriages, separations, deaths, were increasingly mediated through the presence of the palace. Its gates became points of gathering. Its façade, a backdrop for moments of collective attention. The building absorbed these events without altering its structure, but their repetition changed its role. It became a surface onto which meaning was projected. In 1992, a fire at Windsor Castle, another royal residence, triggered renewed scrutiny of how such buildings were maintained and funded. Though Buckingham Palace was not directly affected, the implications extended to it. Questions of responsibility, access, and cost intensified. In response, the palace opened further. Public tours expanded. Revenue became part of its justification. The building, once sustained by assumption, now participated in its own preservation through controlled exposure. Visitors moved through rooms not as guests of ceremony, but as observers of a system that required their presence. The architecture remained largely unchanged. But its purpose had shifted. It was no longer sufficient for the palace to exist as a symbol of continuity. It had to demonstrate its relevance through adaptation, through access, through visibility, through a form of participation that had not been part of its original design. And yet, the core structure resisted complete redefinition. The central quadrangle remained enclosed. The primary façade continued to present a controlled image, unchanged in its proportions. Behind it, the internal divisions persisted, rooms separated by function, corridors defined by hierarchy. The building adapted around its edges. At its center, it remained fixed. This produced a condition that was neither decline nor stability. It was something closer to mutation. Buckingham Palace continued to exist, not by fulfilling its original purpose, but by modifying the terms under which that purpose could be understood. It survived not as a resolved structure, but as one in constant negotiation with the expectations placed upon it. Its walls endured. But what they were meant to signify no longer held a single, stable meaning. In the early morning, before the gates open, the forecourt is empty. The gravel is undisturbed. The façade, long, pale, and measured, faces outward with the same controlled symmetry it has maintained for more than a century. Windows remain closed. Curtains hang in stillness behind them. Nothing in the exterior suggests how many rooms are occupied, or how many are not. Inside, the corridors extend in silence. Carpets absorb the sound of movement. Doors remain shut unless required to open. Light enters gradually, filtered through layers of glass and fabric, touching surfaces designed to reflect it without revealing age. The scale of the rooms does not diminish in the absence of people. It becomes more apparent. A ballroom without guests does not contract. It expands. The central quadrangle, once struck by bomb blasts and repaired without alteration to its outline, holds its shape. Stone replaces what was lost. The geometry remains consistent. There is no visible interruption in the order it presents. Only the knowledge of what has been removed. Throughout the building, systems continue to operate, quietly, continuously, sustaining conditions that allow the palace to function whether it is seen or not. Heat moves through pipes. Air circulates through spaces designed in another century. Maintenance occurs without spectacle. The structure persists through repetition. Beyond its gates, crowds will gather again. They will look toward the same façade, expecting to see something that confirms its meaning. A figure at a window. A movement behind glass. A signal that the building is not only standing, but inhabited with purpose. But the palace does not answer directly. It presents itself. Room after room remains prepared for use, whether or not that use arrives. Spaces designed for ceremony wait without indication of when they will be required again. Private quarters continue beyond view, separated by layers of access that architecture enforces without explanation. The building holds everything it has been asked to contain. And everything it no longer needs. It does not collapse under contradiction. It absorbs it. Buckingham Palace remains where it has been placed, expanded, repaired, observed, and reinterpreted across generations that have entered and exited its rooms without altering its fundamental presence. It endures not because its purpose is resolved, but because it continues to stand long enough for new meanings to be placed within it. And in the quiet before it is seen again, the structure waits, unchanged in form, uncertain in function. Still requiring an answer it was never built to give.